Social movements can sometimes grow from and off of each other. This was the case for the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement and subsequent black suffrage movements of the 1800s. Today, I would like to share the story of how these movements had once been linked, divided, and reunited once again towards the common cause of equal rights. To quote S. J. Walker in his journal article, Frederick Douglass and Women's Suffrage, the anti-slavery and women's rights movements grew up so closely as to almost be indistinguishable in their earlier period. Walker contends that it was the anti-slavery society that provided the women's suffrage movement the skills necessary to maneuver within parliamentary procedure. Elizabeth Cady Stanton proposed the then controversial idea that women should vote at the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848 at Seneca Falls. Resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure for themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Frederick Douglass stood with her even when this proposition was not upheld by many of Stanton's own supporters, and it was there that the two movements became linked to one another. When the Civil War broke out, suffragists switched their focus entirely towards the abolition of slavery, but when the war was won, the split between the black suffrage and women's suffrage movements began with the passage of the 14th Amendment. Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, which is explicit in its gendered wording, barred women from voting, and the Republican Party was now pushing for another amendment which would guarantee black men the right to vote. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, along with many of their more militant supporters, left the Equal Rights Association to create the National Women's Suffrage Association, and that's when things got tense between women's suffrage and black suffrage movements for a time. Marjorie Nelson states in her 1979 journal article, Women's Suffrage and Race, that race was always an issue within the women's suffrage movement. Now quoting one of Stanton's writings, the insult to women who had labored 30 years for the emancipation of the slave, the deep-seated indignation of the women at the proposition to place the black man above their heads. Stanton and Anthony took to slandering the black suffrage movement for a few years in their newspaper The Revolution, which further alienated the two movements as well as moderates in the women's suffrage movement. The 15th Amendment passed in 1870. Black men now had the right to vote, and tensions began their gradual subsidence over the next 20 years. The battle for a federal amendment granting suffrage to women began to lose some steam after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. More and more young women began to join the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they were less concerned with the new amendment and more concerned with fighting for the issue on a state-by-state basis. It was this shift in focus that marked the end of NWSA's cooling-off period, and in 1890 they joined forces with the more moderate American Women's Suffrage Association to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In the South, laws which disenfranchised black voters were commonplace, and a new tidal wave of racism prompted African Americans to support the suffrage movement once again. To quote the journal article from Marjorie Nelson, liberal middle-class black men and women began to find common cause with liberal whites in opposing segregation and speaking out against the ever-rising tide of racial violence. The suffrage movement found a new direction, as working-class white women, middle-class African Americans, and the new liberal, independent, middle-class brand of women joined forces and participated in street parades across the country, including a massive march turned riot in Washington, D.C. There then existed a base of supporters large enough to get a federal amendment passed, and the rest is history. So what rhetorical lessons can we take from this story? First, there is social movement maintenance. Our textbook states that the onset of the maintenance stage is a critical turning point for a social movement because one direction is toward victory and the other is toward oblivion. Even after the women's suffrage movement had lost some steam after the ratification of the 15th Amendment, they did not stop fighting for their rights, eventually won, and came to a terminable end after accomplishing what they set out to do. However, the cornerstone of these movements is self-perception. Self-perception is what the proponents of these movements established their causes upon, and it is what they altered during the course of the story. Suffragists and abolitionists both felt that the oppressed citizens of this country should have equal rights, and when one movement gained the rights before the other movement felt wronged and dejected. Stanton, Anthony, and their militant supporters felt victimized and lashed out. Organizations split and reformed on the basis of how their members perceived themselves and how they interacted with others in a similar rhetorical sphere. The history of the relationship between these two movements is much more nuanced than what I have described here, but I hope you've learned something, and I hope you've enjoyed the story.